My grandparents were my true family, but when they fell ill, my cousins took over everything and then I. My name is Beckett, and at 27, I can honestly say I wouldn't be the person I am today without my grandparents. Martha, 72, and Charles, 75, raised me, took me in when I was young, and filled my life with all the love and stability that was missing. They were my true family. My parents, by contrast, were rarely around, always too busy with their own lives to settle down long enough to be part of mine. My grandparents took on that role without hesitation, and for that, I owe them everything. Now, though, as they get older, I can see their health beginning to fail. Martha's memory has started to slip, small moments that show up more and more frequently, while Charles's once boundless energy has been replaced by long naps and a growing dependence on his cane. I try to spend as much time with them as possible, helping with finances, medical appointments, and even the little things, like ensuring their favorite foods are in the pantry. It's been hard seeing them age, but I wouldn't be anywhere else. Out of nowhere, however, my cousins, Amber and Ryan, swooped back into the picture. Amber's 28 and Ryan's 30. For years, they were distant at best, living in other cities and rarely visiting, showing up maybe once a year, if that. Now they're acting like they've always been here, calling me to ask about finances, medical details, even arranging to be involved in my grandparents' care. I tried to be understanding at first. Maybe they just felt guilty for not being more involved over the years. But their sudden interest doesn't sit right with me. The first time they visited after this change of heart, they showed up with bright smiles and overly cheerful greetings. Amber embraced me, all sugar and warmth, and Ryan gave me a hearty clap on the back. It felt like I was watching two strangers play the roles of concerned family members. And to my surprise, my grandparents seemed happy to see them, easily charmed by Amber's sudden affection and Ryan's jokes. I stood back, observing, feeling like an outsider in a home I'd lived in most of my life. After dinner that night, while the grandparents were occupied, Amber and Ryan sat me down in the kitchen. Amber's demeanor changed in an instant, her tone taking on a sudden seriousness. "Beckett, we were talking, and we think it's time we help manage things here," she said. "You know, the finances, medical care, the house, all of it." I raised an eyebrow. "I've been taking care of that for years. They're comfortable. They have everything they need." Ryan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That's great, but it's a lot for one person. We're family, Beckett. We should be doing this together." The way he said together didn't feel like an offer. It felt like a quiet but firm declaration that things were about to change, whether I liked it or not. But I brushed off my discomfort. Maybe they were right. Maybe they wanted to help. So I nodded, deciding not to push back, and we agreed to share the responsibilities. But as the days passed, I realized that sharing was the last thing on their minds. Bit by bit, they began taking over tasks I'd always handled. Amber made a point of taking over my grandmother's medical appointments, and Ryan started asking about bank accounts and payments, slipping it into conversations as though he were simply curious. One afternoon, I walked into the living room to find Ryan sitting with my grandfather's checkbook, scanning through recent entries with a frown. He looked up as I entered, and I could see the irritation flash across his face. "Oh, hey, Beckett," he said, too casually. "I was just checking in on a few payments. We need to be sure everything's in order." I forced a smile, feeling my chest tighten. "I handle that. Charles and Martha have always trusted me with their finances." Ryan shrugged, slipping the checkbook back into the drawer. "That's great, but like we said, we're here to help. You don't have to do everything." They kept going like this, slowly inserting themselves into every corner of my grandparents' lives. Within weeks, it felt like I'd been pushed aside in my own home. Amber started changing little things without asking, switching their preferred doctors, signing them up for services they didn't need, even suggesting new places to invest their savings. I tried to intervene, gently asking why we were making so many sudden changes, but she'd smile, pat me on the shoulder, and say, "Oh, Beckett, you're just so used to doing things your way. You'll get used to this in no time." The breaking point came one evening when Amber and Ryan announced that they'd hired a new financial advisor for Charles and Martha. I'd never heard of this person, and neither had my grandparents. It's important to have someone professional handle these things, Amber said smoothly, sipping her coffee. No offense, Beckett, but you're not exactly an expert. I couldn't believe the audacity. They've trusted me to handle everything because I know what they want, I replied, struggling to keep my voice calm. We've never needed an outsider. They've always been comfortable. Amber tilted her head, her expression pitying. Beckett, I know this is hard for you. It's just they're getting older, and we want to make sure they're secure. You can still be involved, of course, but we'll be managing things from here. I looked over at my grandparents, who were seated nearby. They were quiet, a bit lost, but they nodded, clearly uncertain but reassured by Amber's charm and Ryan's smooth talk. It felt like I was losing them, like everything they'd entrusted to me was slipping through my fingers. Over the following weeks, I began noticing other, more concerning changes. Accounts I'd monitored for years now had new passwords. Appointments were rescheduled without my knowledge. When I tried asking Amber or Ryan about it, they brushed me off, making it sound like I was overly attached or paranoid. They even implied to my grandparents that I might be stressed, that maybe I should take a step back to relax. The problem was that I couldn't relax. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. And the more they took control, the more I felt like an outsider in my grandparents' lives, the family they had built around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this, that their sudden interest was more than simple family duty. It was time to start paying closer attention. I didn't know what I'd find, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let Amber and Ryan take away the trust my grandparents had placed in me. Not without a fight. Over the next few weeks, Amber and Ryan's involvement escalated from helping to taking over entirely. Each time I visited my grandparents' house, it felt less like the warm, familiar place I'd known all my life and more like a controlled environment where every move was monitored. If I stayed late or tried to spend one-on-one time with Charles or Martha, one of my cousins would suddenly appear, offering to take over or reminding me that too many visitors could be tiring for them. One morning, I walked into the living room to see Amber carefully studying a stack of financial documents. She looked up, giving me a tight smile, but quickly returned her attention to the papers. "What's all this?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just making sure everything's in order," she replied smoothly. "You know, Beckett, these finances are more complex than you might realize. Ryan and I are just trying to be responsible." "Complex?" I repeated, struggling to keep my irritation in check. "I've been managing these for years, Amber. Our grandparents trust me with their finances." She looked at me, feigning sympathy. "I'm sure you mean well, Beckett, but they're getting older, and they need someone with a bit more perspective." The way she said it, as though I lacked the intelligence or maturity to manage things, stung. But I forced myself to stay calm. They were subtle with their words, careful to never outright insult me. But I knew what they were doing, questioning my competence, planting seeds of doubt. And slowly but surely, my grandparents started echoing Amber and Ryan's sentiments. One evening, as I sat with my grandfather, he seemed more distant than usual. He finally looked at me and said, "Beckett, you don't have to worry so much. Amber and Ryan are here to take some of the load off you. Maybe you should focus on your own life, too." I tried to keep my disappointment hidden, but I couldn't help asking, "Grandpa, do you think I haven't done a good job helping you all these years?" "Oh, no," he said quickly, patting my shoulder. "You've done more than enough. But you're young, Beckett. You should be out there, not stuck in all this." I nodded, forcing a smile, but it felt hollow. They were chipping away at his confidence in me, just as they'd been chipping away at mine. That night, I lay awake, replaying every conversation with Amber and Ryan, feeling trapped, manipulated, and, above all, alone. The next day, I noticed a few odd charges in the bank statements. Small amounts at first, just enough not to raise immediate suspicion. One was to a restaurant I knew my grandparents would never go to, another to a spa in a different town. When I questioned Amber about it, she brushed it off with a dismissive wave. "Oh, I took Grandma out last week," she said with a smile. "She needed some pampering. Don't you think she deserves that?" It was hard to argue with the idea of treating my grandmother well, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Amber was using their money for her own purposes. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but the charges kept piling up, a new gym membership in my grandfather's name, upgrades to Amber's phone plan, even hotel reservations that neither of my grandparents had mentioned. One night, after I saw yet another strange expense, I tried talking to Ryan. I noticed some unusual charges in the accounts. Do you know anything about them? Ryan shrugged, his expression unreadable. We're just making sure they're well taken care of, Beckett. You worry too much. Maybe it's time to trust us a bit more. It was the way he said it, that hint of condescension, that made me see the truth more clearly. I was in a battle I hadn't anticipated. They were slowly isolating me, making me look overly involved, overly protective, while they assumed the roles of the calm, responsible family members who just wanted to help. The worst part was, they were doing it so subtly that even my grandparents were starting to believe them. My grandmother would look at me with a faintly disappointed expression whenever I asked too many questions, her trust in me beginning to fade as Amber and Ryan continued their campaign. And I could feel my own confidence slipping, my every attempt to protect them coming across as desperation rather than care. But I wasn't about to back down. One evening, I stayed late after Amber and Ryan had left. I sat with Charles and Martha, trying to reconnect, trying to remind them of the bond we shared. I told them stories of my childhood, of the many ways they'd supported me, hoping to rekindle the warmth between us. At one point, my grandmother squeezed my hand, smiling softly, and for a moment, I felt like maybe I was getting through to her. But then, the door opened and Amber walked in, her eyes narrowing slightly as she saw us together. "Oh, Beckett, I didn't realize you'd be here this late," she said, her voice light but her eyes hard. I gave her a small nod. "Just catching up with Grandma and Grandpa." She raised an eyebrow, her smile tight. "Well, I think they need some rest now. They had a long day. Maybe it's best to head out." It was clear she was reclaiming her territory, reasserting her control. I left, my frustration simmering, realizing just how careful they were being in their manipulation. I couldn't afford to push back too hard, or they'd find a way to make me look even more unreasonable. After another restless night, I decided it was time to take action. I began documenting everything, every unusual charge, every questionable decision, every instance of them isolating me from my grandparents. I kept a notebook hidden in my room, meticulously recording each detail. If I couldn't convince my grandparents to trust me, I'd find a way to gather the proof I needed to reveal the truth to them. I also started speaking with a few close friends about what was happening, people who had known my grandparents and me for years. They were supportive, concerned, and agreed to keep an eye out for anything strange. It felt good to have allies, even if it was just a few people. I couldn't do this alone, and knowing I had others on my side gave me a new sense of determination. The final straw came when I learned that Amber and Ryan had taken my grandparents to a lawyer, someone I'd never heard of, to discuss changes to their financial arrangements. When I confronted Amber, her response was chilling. "Beckett, you're not the only one who cares about them. They're family to us too, and we're just making sure things are in order. You need to accept that you can't control everything." Her words echoed in my mind long after she'd left, filling me with a dread I couldn't shake. She was right about one thing. I couldn't control everything, but I could protect my grandparents' interests, even if it meant stepping outside my comfort zone. It was time to look for answers in places I hadn't considered. My grandfather had always kept important documents locked away in his study, a place Amber and Ryan rarely bothered with. I knew that if there were any documents showing my grandparents' true wishes, they'd be there. Late one night, while my grandparents slept and Amber and Ryan were nowhere in sight, I crept into the study, my heart pounding. I was about to invade their privacy, but I couldn't let my guilt stop me. I needed proof, something that would show Amber and Ryan's intentions for what they were. And as I opened the desk drawer and saw a small locked safe tucked inside, I felt a spark of hope. Whatever was in that safe, it might be the key to protecting the people who had always protected me. The safe was right where I remembered, tucked under my grandfather's desk, half hidden by a stack of old books. My heart raced as I knelt down, fingers trembling slightly as I fumbled with the lock. I'd only seen him open it a few times, but I was pretty sure I remembered the combination. I whispered the numbers under my breath, twisting the dial with as much precision as my nerves would allow. Finally, with a quiet click, the lock turned, and I lifted the heavy metal door. Inside were a few carefully organized stacks of papers, some bound in manila folders, others loose. The faint scent of aged paper filled the air, bringing a wave of memories from nights spent in this very room with Charles, listening to his stories of life and his advice on handling responsibilities. I took a deep breath, pulling out the first folder. The first few papers were familiar: property deeds, tax records, and other routine documents I'd seen over the years. But as I dug deeper, I found what I was really looking for: the will. It was dated about 5 years back, just after my grandmother's health began to decline and my grandfather started to grow more concerned about the future. I opened it carefully, scanning the pages, my eyes widening as I read. My grandparents had left the majority of their estate to me. I paused, rereading the lines, almost unable to believe it. There it was in black and white. Their home, a significant portion of their savings, and a few other assets were to go to me. My cousins weren't left out entirely, but their shares were small compared to mine. This wasn't about favoritism or neglect. I understood immediately that they trusted me to manage things responsibly, that they saw me as the person who would honor their legacy and care for what they'd built. My mind raced, putting the pieces together. Amber and Ryan must have realized this. Somehow, they must have learned about the will or at least suspected it. That explained their sudden reappearance, their gradual takeover of responsibilities, and the carefully orchestrated distance they were placing between me and my grandparents. They weren't here to help. They were here to ensure they'd gain control over the estate, regardless of my grandparents' actual wishes. I kept reading, flipping through the documents. My grandfather had been thorough. He'd left detailed instructions about his medical care, his finances, and even personal requests for how he wanted the house to be kept. He trusted me with these responsibilities, assuming I would continue to be there for them as I always had been. And yet, my cousins had swooped in, capitalizing on my grandparents' failing health to undermine his carefully laid plans. One document, in particular, caught my eye. It was a letter from my grandfather, dated a few years back. It seemed to be more personal than the other papers, and the words felt like they were meant specifically for me. "Beckett," it began, "if you're reading this, then you are likely facing difficult choices. Your grandmother and I have tried to build a legacy, and we trust that you, above anyone else, will understand how to honor it. We've watched you grow into someone dependable and compassionate, and it's our deepest wish that you will continue to care for our family's future." The letter continued, outlining his hopes for the property and the funds he'd saved. But what struck me most was his tone. He spoke as though he knew he was placing a great weight on me, as though he knew that others might challenge these decisions. It was like he'd foreseen the exact situation I was now in. I folded the letter, carefully placing it back in the folder, feeling a mix of sadness and determination. My grandparents had trusted me, counting on me to respect their wishes and protect what they'd worked so hard to build. Amber and Ryan's actions weren't just an inconvenience. They were a betrayal of that trust, a blatant attempt to manipulate the situation for their own gain. The next step was clear. I needed to confront them, but I couldn't go in unprepared. I spent the next few days gathering evidence, meticulously noting every unusual financial transaction, and compiling a record of each new charge Amber and Ryan had made without consulting me or, more importantly, without my grandparents' knowledge. I visited Gregory, the family lawyer who had helped my grandparents draft the will, and shared everything I'd found. He was understanding, his concern growing as he heard the full story. "Your grandparents were clear in their intentions, Beckett," Gregory said, tapping the papers. "Their wishes are outlined explicitly here, and these documents make it hard for anyone to claim otherwise. However, you're right to be cautious. We need to make sure Amber and Ryan don't find any loopholes or ways to manipulate things in their favor." We devised a plan, carefully crafting a way to bring the matter to light without it devolving into a shouting match. Gregory suggested organizing a family meeting, one where he would present the will and the relevant documents as the family's legal representative. That way, everything would be official and on record. It was risky, but I agreed. If Amber and Ryan had any chance of being reasonable, this would be it. The night before the meeting, I could barely sleep. My mind kept racing, replaying everything that had happened. The gradual takeover, the small digs at my credibility, the feeling of being shut out from the people who meant everything to me. But the letter from my grandfather kept me grounded, reminding me that I was doing this for them, not for myself. The day of the meeting arrived, and the tension in the room was palpable. Amber and Ryan were there, acting confident, as though they'd already won. My grandparents sat nearby, looking a bit bewildered, but they trusted Gregory, and I hoped that trust would extend to me once they understood the full story. Gregory cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. Thank you all for being here. Today, I'd like to review the final wishes and legal arrangements that Charles and Martha made regarding their estate. These documents were created with careful thought and a great deal of respect for family values, and I believe they deserve our respect and attention as well. Amber's smile faded slightly as Gregory began reading aloud the relevant sections of the will. Line by line, he laid out my grandparents' intentions, including the inheritance details that clearly placed the majority of their estate in my care. Ryan's face twisted with disbelief, and Amber's eyes narrowed, her earlier confidence dissolving into something much darker. Once Gregory finished, I spoke up, addressing my grandparents directly. Charles, Martha, I never wanted to make this into an argument. I just want you to know that I'm here to honor what you both want. Nothing more. Amber couldn't hold back any longer. She leaned forward, her tone bitter. This is ridiculous. Beckett is only doing this for himself. He's just trying to take everything so he can play the hero. I met her gaze, my voice steady. This isn't about me, Amber. This is about respecting their wishes. You had years to be part of their lives, and now, you're only here to take advantage of their kindness. That's not family. Ryan scoffed, crossing his arms. You're not the only one who cares about them, Beckett. You think we didn't see through your act? You want control because you're afraid of us calling you out. But Gregory intervened before it could escalate further. The will is legally binding, and Charles and Martha's intentions are clear. Any attempt to alter it without their explicit consent would be considered a violation. As the weight of Gregory's words settled in, I could see Amber and Ryan's resolve waver. They'd underestimated my willingness to fight, and now, backed by the will and my grandparents' trust, I had the power to ensure they couldn't manipulate their way into control. When the meeting ended, I stayed behind to speak privately with my grandparents. They listened, their eyes softening as I explained everything I'd seen, everything I'd worried about. And in that moment, I could feel the bond we'd always had, stronger than ever. As I left the room, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. My grandparents had entrusted me with their legacy, and I was ready to protect it, no matter the cost. The day after the family meeting, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. My grandparents' trust in me was clear, and I was determined to protect their legacy. But as I made my way to the house, my mind buzzing with thoughts of how I'd discuss everything with them, a feeling of dread started to gnaw at me. Amber and Ryan weren't the type to accept defeat easily, and I knew they'd be waiting for their moment. As I walked through the front door, I heard voices from the living room, Amber and Ryan's. They were already there, their tones tense and hushed, though their words were unintelligible. My grandparents' voices were absent, and a strange quietness hung over the air, setting my nerves on edge. Before I could reach the living room, Amber appeared, stepping into the hallway as if she'd been waiting for me. She looked at me with a cold, mocking smile, her gaze sharper than I'd ever seen it. Well, look who finally decided to show up, she sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. I narrowed my eyes, refusing to let her rattle me. I need to speak with Charles and Martha. Amber's smile widened, more menacing than before. Oh, I'm sure you do, Beckett. You've got quite the agenda, don't you? Before I could respond, Ryan appeared behind her, arms crossed, his expression equally hostile. Amber's right, he said, his tone challenging. We know what you're up to. We've seen through your little act. I felt a surge of frustration, but I forced myself to stay calm. This isn't an act, Ryan. I'm here for them. I've always been here for them. Ryan scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. Spare us the sob story. You think you're the golden child, don't you? The one they entrusted everything to while we were just supposed to stand by, grateful for the scraps? It's pathetic, Beckett. You're no hero. You're just a selfish little boy who thinks he's better than us. I took a step closer, holding his gaze. This isn't about me or what I want. It's about respecting our grandparents' wishes. They trusted me because I've been here for them. And you only showed up when you thought you could benefit. Amber folded her arms, her gaze ice cold. You act like you're the only one who cares about them. We're family too, Beckett. Or did you forget that? Her words stung, but not in the way she intended. They were a reminder of how far Amber and Ryan had twisted the concept of family, warping it into something selfish and toxic. I shook my head, determined to push through their accusations. Family isn't just about blood. It's about loyalty, care, and respect. All things you've disregarded the moment you thought you could take over their lives. Amber laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Oh, please. You're only saying that because you don't want to lose control. You're scared, Beckett. Scared that they'll see you for what you really are. A manipulator trying to cut us out. Her words cut deeper than I wanted to admit, stirring up doubts I'd tried to ignore. But as much as their accusations stung, I knew the truth. My grandparents had trusted me, not them. They had relied on me to be their support, their advocate. I couldn't let Amber and Ryan twist the truth to suit their narrative. Maybe you're the ones who need to take a hard look at yourselves, I said, my voice steady. Everything you're accusing me of is exactly what you're trying to do. Take control, ignore their wishes, and put yourselves first. Ryan's face twisted with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. You think you're so righteous, don't you? Acting like some martyr. But we see right through you. You're just as selfish as anyone else. I felt my frustration building, but I wouldn't let them sidetrack me. Where are they? I need to speak with them. Amber's gaze darkened, and she stepped in front of me, blocking my path. No, Beckett, they don't need to hear your lies. They deserve peace, not your selfish crusade to make yourself the center of their lives. Her words were calculated, laced with venom meant to chip away at my resolve. But I could see through her act. You don't get to decide what they need. You don't know them the way I do. Ryan laughed, shaking his head. That's where you're wrong, Beckett. We know exactly what they need. Better care, better guidance. They don't need someone holding them back, suffocating them with your so-called protection. I clenched my fists, the weight of their words hitting me harder than I expected. But deep down, I knew what they were doing, turning the truth on its head, projecting their own motives onto me. I was the obstacle, the person standing in the way of the legacy they believed was theirs for the taking. Amber took a step closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. You're not family, Beckett. You're just an entitled kid with a superiority complex. We're the real family. And once we're done, everyone will know it. Her words made my heart pound, but I refused to back down. That's not your decision to make. My grandparents already made their wishes clear, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure they're respected. Amber's expression hardened, her gaze filled with pure animosity. If you think you're going to win this, you're more naive than I thought. Ryan moved closer, his voice low but filled with a chilling certainty. You're alone, Beckett. You have no one on your side, no one who will stand by you once they see you for what you really are. Their words echoed in my mind, their accusations and disdain swirling together into a knot of anger and betrayal. But even as their accusations chipped away at me, I knew one thing for sure. My grandparents' trust was in me, not them. And I wasn't going to let these two manipulate, control, or rewrite the truth. Maybe I am alone, I replied, my voice steady. But that won't stop me from protecting them. You're only here for yourselves, and deep down, you both know it. Amber sneered, her gaze unwavering. Believe what you want, Beckett, but you're only delaying the inevitable. With that, they stepped aside, letting me pass, but their words lingered long after I walked through the door. The sense of betrayal cut deep, sharper than I'd anticipated. I knew I was fighting an uphill battle against my own family, and that the road ahead was far from easy. But I couldn't let them destroy everything my grandparents had built, everything they'd entrusted to me. As I approached my grandparents, their faces filled with warmth and love, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I would stand by them, no matter how much Amber and Ryan tried to undermine me. Because in the end, I knew who I was fighting for, and that was worth more than any legacy Amber and Ryan could ever claim. After my confrontation with Amber and Ryan, I knew that it was time to take real, decisive action. The next day, I met with Gregory, our family's lawyer, bringing him the will and every document I'd found in my grandfather's safe. Gregory reviewed everything, his expression growing serious as he read through the legal arrangements my grandparents had set up years ago. "Beckett," Gregory said, looking up, "your grandparents' wishes are very clear here. The estate, the assets, all of it. What they left to you was intentional and carefully thought out. No one can argue this was done lightly." I felt a wave of relief, but Gregory's tone remained cautious. "That being said, we need to prepare. Amber and Ryan might attempt to sway your grandparents one last time. I recommend we go through this with your grandparents, step by step. They need to hear this from me as their attorney." Together, we arranged a family meeting. I dreaded the confrontation but knew it was necessary. I wanted my grandparents to hear everything, to see the truth for themselves. I arrived early, helping my grandparents settle in, and assured them that everything would be explained clearly and honestly. Their trust in me was evident, but I could see a hint of confusion too. Amber and Ryan's influence had left its mark, even on them. Amber and Ryan arrived shortly after, faces masked in their typical polite smiles. But I could sense their tension, especially when they saw Gregory there. They knew this wasn't just a casual conversation. It was the endgame. Gregory began by reading the will, detailing every aspect of my grandparents' wishes. He explained how they had set things up so that their legacy would be managed by someone they trusted implicitly, me. As he spoke, I watched my grandparents' faces. Slowly, their expressions shifted, surprise giving way to understanding, and finally, a look of relief. The truth was right in front of them, validated by someone they trusted. When Gregory finished, I turned to my grandparents. "Charles, Martha, I know Amber and Ryan have done a lot lately to be here for you. But I need you to know that every decision I've made has been with your best interests in mind. I just want to honor what you both wanted." My grandmother looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh, Beckett," she whispered, reaching for my hand. "We've always known how much you care." But Amber wasn't willing to give up without a fight. She stood, her voice sharp. "So that's it? You're all just going to ignore everything Ryan and I have done for this family? We've been here too, and we deserve a say." Ryan chimed in, his voice laced with frustration. "This is ridiculous. Beckett's just using his influence to take everything. Can't you see what he's doing?" But the truth had already settled. My grandparents looked at Amber and Ryan, disappointment etched on their faces. My grandfather spoke, his voice steady. "We've given you both every opportunity to be part of this family. But Beckett has been here, day in and day out. This isn't about control. It's about trust." Amber and Ryan's defiance faded, replaced by a mixture of anger and resentment. Realizing they'd lost, they turned on their heels and left without another word, their departure as final as it was silent. Once they were gone, my grandparents pulled me into a tight embrace. The relief I felt was overwhelming, and for the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. Gregory assured us that everything was legally secure and that Amber and Ryan couldn't challenge the arrangements. In the days that followed, I helped my grandparents return to the life they deserved, one where they were cared for, respected, and surrounded by people who genuinely loved them. Family members, seeing the truth, rallied around us, offering support, understanding, and respect. Standing with my grandparents, I felt the immense gratitude of having honored their wishes. Their legacy was safe, and the trust they'd placed in me had been upheld. The chapter with Amber and Ryan had closed, and as difficult as it had been, I knew that my place in this family was exactly where it was meant to be, by my grandparents' side, protecting what they had worked a lifetime to build.